Hey guys, Zack here, and this is my review of Scooby-Doo Mystery Incorporated. Okay, so this episode is pretty much one of the most straightforward episodes of Scooby-Doo, and possibly just in general, the most straightforward episode of Scooby-Doo Mystery Incorporated that we've had yet, and possibly in the entire franchise. I don't know. I would have to watch through the entire franchise because I'm a little bit fuzzy on some of them. But yeah, this is probably one of the most straightforward mysteries in the series, if not just Scooby-Doo Mystery Incorporated. But and also as a result of that, we get a lot more character building moments and lore details in this one. So okay, so to start off the actual review, though, I do want to make a little bit of a funny mention where I brought up before that we've had a bunch of recaps that reference previously important information regarding the story and what you need to know going into the episode. This episode decides to not do that. So, first and foremost, Scooby is the one who delivers the recap for this episode, but it is like a kind of like a subversion of what they usually do at the start of the episodes for season 2. Scooby's recap has nothing to do with any of the previous episodes and is literally just there to show as a showcase of all of the food that Scooby and Shaggy have eaten over the course of the series, including an unseen scene of them eating the cornbread stuffing from Web of the Dreamweaver. There's a brief mention of it where they go off to go eat the cornbread stuffing, and it's never really brought up before now. But there is in fact a scene of them eating the cornbread stuffing with Sheriff Stone, which happened off screen, was never officially shown in the episode. And it's just a really funny little side detail that I just like. But yeah, the recap episode is just completely useless, which just further emphasizes the point that this is a very straightforward episode and you don't need to know much of anything to go into it. But in case, the episode then proceeds to open up with a movie night at the local cemetery, and of course at the Crystal Coast Cemetery we actually do find out that Mayor Nels has actually put on a movie night. And she's actually showing a Vincent Van Gogh movie, and what we find out is that it is relevant to the story because it is a movie where Vincent Van Gogh's character is being hounded by ghouls, and he eventually becomes one himself throughout the course of the movie, Of course, Shaggy is very much pointing out how scary the movie is, and that he'd hate to be a ghoul. While Scooby, who is actually there with Nova, then proceeds to cover her eyes and tells her to not look, and she responds to that by licking his cheek. But and it's also at this point where of course Fred and Daphne are together with Mayor Nettles, and Fred does tell her that her movie was actually a really good success, and that he hopes it'll do well and bring more people out. But and then they suddenly hear a noise that isn't coming from the movie, and sure enough, the movie screen that's just propped up in front of one of the mausoleums is ripped open, and then we see the actual graveyard ghoul, which Shaggy actually winds up giving the name to. He's the one who actually calls it the graveyard ghoul when he sees it, and then proceeds to cause people to rampages through the entire thing as everybody tries to get away from him. But yeah, and also in the process, they just kind of completely dismantle the movie night. There's not only when they come to check back the next morning, the projector that was playing the Vincent Van Gogh movie is turned over on its side. There's just torn picnic blankets just strewn everywhere, and they're looking, and of course Fred is poking around looking for clues, pointing out that the graveyard ghoul has to have left something, but they can't actually find anything related to the graveyard ghoul. And as Velma's investigating, she hears a strange grumbling noise, and sure enough pulls away a piece of curtain to reveal a man named Evallo, who as we find out is primary suspect number 1 according to Velma, because what we quickly find out is that Evallo is a very very openly weird. He has a very bad temper, and he likes to growl and shamble around and a whole bunch of other things that the graveyard ghoul is known for doing. But and of course, Velma immediately recognizes that Evallo is most likely the graveyard ghoul since he behaves very suspiciously like him. But of course, the rest of the gang then proceed to completely dismiss her point. And of course, Fred actually knows who Evallo is, pointing out that he is actually an old friend of his, and that they've buried a couple of things over the years. And explains that he's actually the grave digger for the Crystal Cove Cemetery, and goes up to greet Evallo like an old friend, but Evallo just kind of snacks at him and tells him to watch his back, which and Fred just plays it off as a joke. But of course, Velma once again insists on the fact that he is in fact the graveyard ghoul, because he's obviously shambling around. He's quite literally growling at her. But of course, everybody once again is completely skeptical about the fact that it might in fact be the graveyard ghoul, and of course, Fred even points out that Velma should know better, since they don't do villain profiling. They go work through every possible angle and try to find all the different things that don't really make sense. In case in point, he turns around and finds a very picturesque house that is just sitting in the middle of the graveyard for some reason, and he openly admits he's never seen it before, so he brings the rest of the gang to actually go and investigate that, despite Velma's protests. And of course he immediately knocks on the door, at which point we meet Motor Bjorklund, who, as we find out, is an immigrant from a German country, and from that general area. German, I don't know. She has a German-ish accent. She may in fact be from Germany, but I'm not 100%. But her name implies that she's from the general area of Austria, Germany, Hungary, all those locations that are in there. She's vaguely from there-ish. But of course, Motor Bjorklund invites him in, pointing out that it's been a while since she's had guests, and does introduce herself, pointing out that she is actually the owner of the graveyard, and does point out that she's actually came there from the old country with her 3 beautiful daughters, who she openly admits don't talk, and we actually do meet them, but they literally all look the same, literally, and they literally just look the same, but. In case she introduces them, and of course Fred and Shaggy are immediately smitten with the 3 beautiful girls, but of course Fred immediately pulls everybody into a group huddle and points out that they should probably investigate the Bjorklund house a little bit more, pointing out that obviously a group of women this beautiful has to be guilty of something, so they point out that they should absolutely investigate, and of course Velma and Daphne are both point out that doesn't seem like a very good idea, but Fred then proceeds to break before they can get a word in, and decides that they're going to stay at the Bjorklund house to investigate a little bit more. And with that, the boys then proceed to wander into the kitchen. While Velma real quickly realizes that she's going to need to most likely go and do some actual investigative work on her own, and then proceeds to ask Daphne if she's coming, but Daphne merely responds that she needs to keep an eye on the boys and volunteers to keep an eye on them until their quote-unquote investigation is done. So Velma then proceeds to go off on her own and decides to do some investigating by herself. At which point the Bjorklunds then proceed to display that they have very proficient cooking, and also remark that apparently in the maybe German country where they're from, talking dogs are apparently just very common, and they point out that they aren't even remotely surprised by the fact that Scooby can talk. They openly admit that, but they also point out that in the old country everybody there knew how to appreciate a good meatball, and sure enough, pulls out an entire tray full of meatballs. And of course, Scooby, Shaggy, and Fred immediately start digging in. At which point, we find out why Motor Bjorklund moved to America. As we find out, she had actually come there to run the graveyard, and pointing out that she wanted to bring in some extra cash, and does point out that it is actually next to a really good location, pointing out that it's next to the Crystal Cove Gas Company, But also points out that the graveyard hasn't actually been pulling in as much money as she would have liked. But of course does point out that she actually is very happy because it means that she's actually been able to make some new friends and meet new visitors, and sure enough gives the boys another pile of meatballs, and also points out that once they're done they'll have some chocolate, and it's at this point where Daphne displays an interesting little character trait that persists throughout this episode, where she perks up at the second she hears the word chocolate. And immediately asks Motor Bjorklund like a million questions about what kind of chocolate it is, about the cocoa content and a whole bunch of other things that people would know about the chocolate. But she's notably a little antsy when it comes to chocolate. But she eventually drops it and goes off into the other room. Meanwhile, Velma is on her way back to their headquarters back to her headquarters underneath the Crystal Cove Town Hall, when she's actually stopped by Mr. E, who just appears out of an alleyway, and she openly asks if he was waiting for her, and he openly admits that he was in fact waiting for her, and points out that he did actually want to talk to her because he points out that he does want her on his team again, pointing out that she was always the go-getter of their mystery group, and does proceed to point out that he would absolutely love her help, because what's coming is going to be very, very dangerous and very big for Crystal Cove, and he's going to need all the help he can get. But Velma points out that she's not really interested in working for him again, pointing out that obviously it didn't work out too well the last time, and also points out that he's a little bit of a creep, and points out that she wishes she had never worked with him to begin with, and with that proceeds to walk off to go and do an investigation. While of course, as we find out, Miss Professor Pericles had apparently been watching from a tree nearby, and does point out that it seems like that Ricky has finally tasted the cold, bitter taste of rejection, and of course, Mr. E quickly whips around and asks why he's there and what he's currently doing there, and what we find out is that Professor Pericles, which was established in a previous episode, but Professor Pericles is trying to assemble the rest of the Mystery Incorporated again, and he's having mixed results. As he points out, he's tried to reach out to all of them, but they haven't exactly been very, very receptive. As he points out, Cassidy, of course, has been angry and bitter because of everything that's happened. Brad and Judy have been kind of enigmas, and he can't really figure either of them out, which only really leaves Mr. E, and he refers to him as his sweet Ricky, which Mr. E immediately tells him not to call him that anymore, pointing out that he's revoked the right to talk to him about like that when he decided to betray him, and then proceeds to just kind of storm off back to his lair. And of course we don't really find, and of course it's at this point where once again the Mystery Incorporated sans Velma is still trying to investigate Motor Bjorklund. When Motor Bjorklund remarks that she's going to be getting some dessert berries from the basement, and she does indeed walk off. And it's at this point where the graveyard girl actually winds up barging in and tries to attack the three girls. But of course Fred, Shaggy and Scooby then proceed to start pelting him with meatballs to get him to leave them alone. And of course that works up until they run out of meatballs, at which point Daphne grabs the plate and throws it at him. And of course that winds up causing the graveyard ghoul to eventually give up and admit defeat, but then tells them to leave the graveyard while they still can, and barges and jumps out the window. At which point Motor Bjorklund immediately comes back, and she does have the berries, but she also is a little confused as to what's going on, because she quickly realizes that her house had been torn up and she has no idea what happened. But and of course, this is at this point where she decides to actually thank the rest of Mystery Incorporated for actually saving her house and her three girls, and decides to actually, as a sign of appreciation, decides to create little chocolate statues of all of the Mystery Incorporated gang, sans Velma, who is currently off doing her own thing. And of course, everybody accepts them with open arms, and Shaggy openly admits that he's very happy to have a little statue of him that he can eat. But of course, Daphne openly tries to turn down the offer, but when she sees the three girls starting to cry because they actually did put a lot of love and care into making the little statues, Daphne decides that she doesn't want to be rude and decides to take a very small bite, and notably becomes a little twitchy. So yeah, I'll get to that in a minute. But meanwhile, Velma is actually doing an investigation into Evallo, and what we find out is that his full name is Count Evallo von Meanskrieg, and what we find out is that most of the background surrounding him is largely lost and otherwise hard to find, but the sole document that Velma is able to find on the computer reveals that he did in fact have a worker's permit that he was rejected for, because as we find out, the aptitude test regarded him as pure evil, which of course Velma points out as a sign to point out that he most likely is in fact the graveyard ghoul, and decides to go tell the rest of the gang what she knows. And meanwhile, as that is happening, we actually see Mr. E playing with his guitar, and he's looking at an old picture of himself and Professor Pericles on one of his monitors, and wonders if they were really that young when they first met. And sure enough, we then proceed to get a flashback where it's revealed how Ricky and Professor Pericles actually met. As it turns out, Mr. E was actually playing in his yard when he was really young, and Professor Pericles wound up flying into a tree uncontrollably and wound up breaking his wing. And though Professor Pericles does in fact kiss at Mr. E and Ricky when he tries to pick him up, he eventually lets Ricky pick him up, and Ricky slowly nurses Professor Pericles back to health until Professor Pericles is able to fly again. And when the fated day finally does come, where Professor Pericles is able to finally take off and leave Ricky, he decides to come back, and they kind of sort of become fast friends. As we find out, not really, because obviously they have a bit of a strange relationship nowadays, but back in the day, Ricky and Professor Pericles did in fact have a close bond, where the former nursed the latter back to health, and they were quickly fast friends after that. So yeah, it does imply that they actually were indeed close friends, but not anymore in the present day, because as we find out, they don't really like each other very much. But we will get into that in a little bit. But in any case, after that, we do find out that Fred and Shaggy have actually been looking into the Motor Bjorklund graveyard ghoul connection, and the only thing they really come up with is that they're about the same height, but they do conclude that that's more than enough reason to continue investigating the Bjorklund house and just staying there. And is this where Velma barges in, and she reveals what she's actually found, and of course Fred immediately asks her if she's given up on the whole graveyard ghoul Evallo connection, but she points out that she actually did find something substantial in that Evallo had a worker's permit rejected for being pure evil, and does point out that obviously that means that he most likely is in fact the graveyard ghoul, but of course Fred once again dismisses the idea, pointing out that it's obviously never the obvious guy, and Shaggy does indeed continue that sentiment, and decide that they're going to continue investigating the Bjorklund house and Motor Bjorklund and their beautiful daughters, and of course Velma just kind of rolls her eyes, pointing out that this is clearly getting them nowhere, and then proceeds to turn to Daphne to ask if she's coming, but what we quickly find out is that as I stated, Daphne has gone a little bit chocolate crazy. It's revealed in this episode that Daphne has a bit of a chocolate addiction, and she can't help herself around it, and of course that hasn't come up before now, because she's never been on screen with a piece of chocolate before. But yeah, in this timeline she has a chocolate addiction, and sure enough, when Velma tries to get close to her and asks her if she wants to come investigate, she merely hisses at Velma and tells her not to touch her hoard, claiming that it's all hers. And Velma has no idea how to really respond, so she just kind of awkwardly walks out with no real concludes that she's most likely going to have to do the investigation on her own. And Scooby sees how annoyed she is, and notably is a little concerned for her. And sure enough, in the graveyard, what we find out is Velma is actually currently going through the graveyard when it suddenly becomes very windy, and she starts getting chilly, and she starts walking through the graveyard when she hears something following her. And she immediately panics because she thinks it's the graveyard ghoul. So she immediately starts running and jumping over gravestones, and eventually trips on one. At which point it's revealed that the figure that was chasing her was actually Scooby, who and when she asks him why she was following him, but after admitting that she's happy to see him, he merely responds that he was worried about her and knew she seemed a little on edge. So he decided to come and help, and Velma does appreciate that, pointing out that she thought nobody else cared about the mystery, but Scooby reveals that he does in fact care about the mystery. At which point it's revealed that the graveyard ghoul has actually been standing behind them the whole time, and he admits that he would like to see them solve the mystery as well. At which point he then proceeds to chase. The graveyard ghoul then proceeds to just start chasing after them and starts roaring at them and trying to scare them off. And eventually Scooby tells Velma to grab on, and they leap over the fence to the graveyard, with the graveyard ghoul eventually leaving them alone once they're out of the vicinity of the graveyard, and proceeds to wander off. And of course Velma is very happy that Scooby was able to save her. But then Scooby notes that he smells a very interesting smell, and of course Velma wonders if it is in fact her, because she points out that when she wears sweaters and does a lot of exercise, she starts sweating a lot, but then decides that she feels like they have more than enough conclusive evidence to have Evallo arrested. So she and Scooby go to Sheriff Stone's office at the Crystal Cove Police Department, and what we find, and of course she then proceeds to point out that she would very much like if they were able to actually go and investigate the graveyard ghoul, and points out that he should probably go and arrest him, and arrest Evallo specifically for quite possibly being the graveyard ghoul. But it's at this point where Sheriff Stone outright refuses, even though he points out that there is a lot of evidence pointing to Evallo. And the reason he gives is that apparently. And this makes sense in context, but apparently, because Sheriff Stone has regularly arrested the wrong person in regards to all of these investigations, Sheriff Stone has a series of lawsuits a mile high for every single person he's falsely arrested. What we find out is that because he's arrested so many people under false pretenses, and then they wound up being the wrong guy, he just keeps constantly getting sued. So for that reason, he's not going to take a chance and hope that Evallo is the right guy, because obviously he's learned by this point. He's learned that he shouldn't just arrest the wrong person until he has definitive proof that it's who they're supposed to be. And of course, both Velma and Scooby just look at him, with Scooby adding that he is a terrible sheriff, and Sheriff Stone just mumbles under his breath that the dog has clearly been talking to his lawyer. But to this point, where Velma decides to plead to Sheriff Stone to finally that he could finally arrest the right guy for once, and points out that this is his chance to redeem himself and become a somewhat competent sheriff. And ironically enough, at hearing somewhat competent, Sheriff Stone's ears perk up, and he does decide to hear Velma out. At which point, Velma reveals that she's noticed that the graveyard ghoul's movements have all been centered on the mausoleum in the center of the graveyard. And sure enough, they go poke inside the mausoleum to discover that apparently the graveyard ghoul had built an entire network of pipes underneath the graveyard, and is currently siphoning gas. And of course, Sheriff Stone points out that seems to be a little bit preposterous, pointing out that obviously there shouldn't be any gas underneath the Crystal Cove Cemetery. He openly points out that all of the gas is underneath the Crystal Cove gas plant, and also mocks Velma for not knowing that, since she's supposed to be a detective. But And to this point, where Velma does point out that obviously she knows that realizes now that they need to actually get ready to trap the graveyard ghoul, and also quotes Fred, pointing out that it's trapping time. At which point they then proceed to come up with a really brilliant idea to lure the graveyard ghoul out of hiding, which is that Sheriff Stone just brings his barbecue that he has. If you guys remember, he had a barbecue a long time ago, but he brings it back. He brings it back in this episode. He brings it to the cemetery and starts grilling. And of course, Velma questions what exactly it is he's doing, pointing out that obviously he shouldn't be grilling. That obviously he shouldn't be. Obviously he doesn't. She doesn't fully understand why grilling meat would lower the graveyard ghoul out of hiding. But he does point out that ghoul or not, nobody can resist his home cooked barbecue. And of course, Scooby then points out that he certainly can't resist it, and goes to take a bite of a quad burger, which just has 4 hamburgers on it. And he immediately goes to bite into it, but then eventually spits it out. And of course, Sheriff Stone is offended because he thinks that Scooby doesn't like his cooking. But as Scooby points out, it's actually in relation to the fact that the graveyard ghoul is currently standing on top of the mausoleum. And the graveyard ghoul sees the barbecue and immediately panics, pointing out that it shouldn't be there, and obviously starts chasing after them to try and get rid of the barbecue. And Scooby, in the process, winds up getting tangled up in the pull chain for the barbecue and starts dragging it behind him, with the graveyard ghoul understandably chasing after him because he's trying to get rid of the barbecue. But of course, this does ultimately result in the two of them actually going into the mausoleum by accident after Scooby accidentally trips on a headstone and winds up hitting the graveyard ghoul with the barbecue. They just kind of both go into the mausoleum, where they accidentally hit the graveyard ghoul's pipe network, and because of that, the entire mausoleum winds up going up in flames. Scooby and the graveyard ghoul are somehow completely fine, by the way. They somehow survive an explosion, but of course, this also causes the entirety of all of the headstones in the Crystal Cove Cemetery to just kind of start erupting out of the ground, because there's a large gas deposit, and it's just creating this snowball effect where everything is just shooting out. But of course, the graveyard ghoul is running around trying to get away from all the falling headstones and other debris that are falling. And at one point, it seems like he's trapped when all of the headstones wind up surrounding him in a circle. But he winds up immediately jumping out of that, only for a pipe from his siphoning network to just land on top of him and trap his arms. And it's at this point where the rest of Mystery Incorporated actually wind up joining in. Including Motor Bjorklund, who quickly shows up and quickly realizes that somebody is destroyed her graveyard, and of course at this point where Velma has actually points out that it wasn't her but rather the graveyard ghoul, and then decides to unmask him to see who he really is. And sure enough, surprising literally no one, it was in fact Evallo. And of course, Evallo then, and of course, Shaggy does point out that it was actually the most obvious guy for once, and does point out that was actually that he was a little surprised. But of course, Evallo then proceeds to explain what his evil plan was, and what we find out is that, simply put, he found out that he used his position as the graveyard gravekeeper to actually just dig under the Crystal Cove Cemetery for gas. And he was using that to kind of hide his operation. He was using the mausoleum to hide his operation. But when he found out that Mayor Nels was starting to throw rather frequent movie nights at the graveyard, he quickly decided that he needed to get rid of anybody who might actually start investigating his plan. So he used the graveyard ghoul costume to scare everybody off. And later, when he found out that Sheriff Stone had brought a barbecue to an open gas site, he quickly realized that it was going to cause everything to blow up, which incidentally it did, and he wound up being right. But so he realized that he needed to actually get rid of the barbecue, pointing out that obviously it was going to cause a lot of problems, and it wound up being right, and he ultimately admits that was actually what led to his capture. But does point out that he's very happy to have finally proven himself as a villain, and ultimately points out that he obviously wanted to actually show off how evil he was. But does admit that he would have gotten away with it if it hadn't been for the sheriff and his barbecue. And Sheriff Stone just kind of is just happily whistling to himself and points out that he's very happy to have finally arrested the right guy for once. At which point he gets into his squad car with Evallo and drives off. And of course, Fred openly apologizes to Velma, pointing out that he should have known better and should have known that even though they don't normally arrest the very suspicious individual, they quickly point out that he quickly points out they should have listened to Velma and they should have investigated Evallo a little bit more. But does point out that it seems like the Bjorklunds have no real connection to the mystery. But as Velma points out, they are connected to the mystery. They just aren't the graveyard ghoul. And also points out that they most likely don't know how they're actually tie into all of it. And of course, Motor Bjorklund immediately scratches her head because she has no idea what Velma's talking about. But then we actually get a cut to Mayor Nettles at Town Hall with both Evallo and the Bjorklunds. And what we find out is that the Crystal Cove Gas Company has actually been illegally siphoning gas from underneath the Crystal Cove Cemetery, and then praise Motor Bjorklund for compensation for that. So and of course Motor Bjorklund is very happy about the fact that she now has money, and then decides that now she can actually finally leave Crystal Cove. And of course this causes Fred to become confused, pointing out that she clearly liked it here, but Motor Bjorklund merely points out that she was just waiting to get a lot of money so that she can go back home and live like a queen. And then gives everybody a farewell salute before leaving. At which point we then find out that Evallo technically got away with what he was trying to do. As we find out, Mayor Nevels points out that apparently Evallo has diplomatic immunity, which basically just means that Sheriff Stone isn't able to arrest him and is forced to let him go and deport him. And Evallo is very happy about that, pointing out that now he can finally prove that he's the most evil in his family, and does point out that everybody in his family is actually pretty evil and that they should see his brothers. And then cheerfully tells Sheriff Stone to deport him, with Sheriff Stone just angrily declaring as he escorts Evallo off that he is never arresting anybody ever again. So yeah, Evallo winds up succeeding in his evil plan. He winds up siphoning gas. He doesn't really wind up siphoning gas, but he also gets away with the fact that he was siphoning gas because he's just deported back to his country. He doesn't get arrested. He doesn't get arrested or tried for his crimes. He's just sent back home with just a little bit of a slap on the wrist. There's literally nothing bad that ever happens to him. But of course, Daphne just points out that she's just happy this is all over, and also points out that it seems like that she points out that obviously they're most likely going to be, that most likely means the Bjorklunds are going to be leaving Crystal Cove forever, but also realizes that means they're going to be taking all their chocolate with them, and immediately runs off in a frenzy to try and catch up with the Bjorklunds. And yeah, that's just a character trait that Daphne apparently exhibits in this episode. That she just really likes chocolate, and I can understand that. Chocolate's delicious, but she's a little bit crazy in that regard. But in case, at the end of the episode, Mr. E then does decide to take Professor Pericles up on his partnership, and the two do decide to salute their new partnership with glasses of grape juice, and Professor Pericles and of course Mr. E was worried that Professor Pericles was never going to come, but whereas Professor Pericles was unsure if Mr. E would actually accept his invitation to work together. And of course, the two then proceed to cheer to their newfound partnership and the treasure underneath Crystal Cove. And Mr. E decides to turn on the radio so that they can listen to some music while they drink. And of course, they immediately hear what they immediately find is the station of K-Ghoul, where Cassidy is currently just broadcasting all of their plans out onto the airwaves. And of course, Mr. E and Professor Pericles quickly realize that if they are to continue with their plan, they're going to have to silence Cassidy forever, and implies that they're going to try and kill her or something else at some point. But Yeah, but yeah, in any case, this episode is very, obviously, is probably the most straightforward mystery ever, because we know it's Evallo from the get-go, and everybody, and of course everybody knows it, except most of Mystery Incorporated, which is just really funny. They're going off and investigating somebody unrelated to what the actual mystery is. And it's just really funny. That for once it's the most obvious guy in the entire room that you can possibly imagine. And then it just turns out to be him, but nobody believes Velma that is actually the guy until the very end. So yeah, it's a little bit fun, and also because of that, we actually get to see a little bit more about what's going on with Professor Pericles and Mr. E and their relationship, and we also find out there's also a fun little character development thing with some character building with Daphne, which revealed that she really likes chocolate to an almost obsessive degree. But yeah, overall, this episode was just a lot of fun. It's stupid, but that is indeed the entire point. So in any case, yeah. Thank you guys so much for watching this review. If you enjoyed, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Also, be sure to follow me on Twitter in the description below. Be sure to check out my Patreon in the description below as well, and over on the end screen. I mostly do it for support projects, so if you absolutely want to check those out, by all means, again, link is down on the description and on the end screen. And speaking of the end screen, if you want to see more content from me, then be sure to check out the videos linked in the end screen. The top video is the most recent one. It may or may not be this one. Whereas the bottom video is a video recommended to you based on what you've already seen from me, so if you want to try something new, or see more of what you like, then be sure to check both of those videos out. But in any case, thank you guys so much for watching, and until next time, I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace!